Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be chatting through the rest of Frieren Beyond Journey's End. I was initially planning to go up through episode 24 after completing up through episode 18, but then having gotten to episode 24 I realized that this was very much in the middle of the certification arc, and thus I thought it'd be best to go ahead and finish out the season and then sit down and do not only a discussion for my first impressions of this last batch of episodes, but also just sort of do an overview of this story. I think the best way for me to summarize my feelings, both all the positives and then the few little negative things, is to say that this is very much a story that is a love letter to the fantasy fan. I'm not sure what your relationship is to fantasy, whether it be fantasy manga and anime, or whether it be fantasy books, TV shows, video games, but I grew up reading a lot of fantasy and playing a lot of fantasy RPGs, so this very much just felt like coming home. I have loved so much of this. This is the sort of story where its setting and its character types are ones that I know they've been done before, but I will never get tired of them being done again so long as the creators of the story really try to do something unique and original with them, or they try to dive really deep into the themes, the characters themselves, and very much I feel like Frieren accomplished this. Because of how familiar this setting is, and because Frieren is building itself upon such a familiar foundation, I think the way in which it managed to set itself apart and really accomplish doing something worthwhile was rooted in its themes, and in combination, I would say, its tone as well. With having this story of what comes after, so often I have found that when stories decide they're going to go there, they're almost more rooted in bleakness and the grim realities of what a journey, the kind of toll it would take on somebody to have gone through a journey like you would have seen with these characters, everything that they endured on that, and then how depressed they are after, which is not something I'm opposed to. I like seeing those sorts of stories as well, but I haven't really seen one done that is having this sense of hopefulness throughout the story, which isn't to say that there are no stakes or that there aren't moments that are pulling at something that is very tragic, but I do think by having this more subtle joy within the story and how it sort of permeates its way into so many of the smaller arcs throughout the show, it just makes it shine in a way that I found really, really appealing. I do, however, think that that little spark was the most present within the first 15, 16-ish episodes, with the last chunk of the show being primarily dedicated to the arc of them getting the certification. I found a lot of what I fell in love with this story, what made me fall in love with it, I think kind of a little bit took a back seat so that we could focus on introducing new characters, having there be what might be a bigger plot moving forward. We obviously see the introduction of another elf. It definitely seems as though they have a different view of magic and the world and their place within it than Frieren does. You do see discussions in this last chunk about finding a way to be somebody that is a powerful mage within a peaceful society versus somebody who thrives within a society that needs a hero or needs that person that can save everyone, and what happens when those people start to become restless because there's peace. So I do look forward to seeing how that is going to play out moving into season 2 and just in general the rest of the story. But there isn't necessarily the same subtlety and the opportunities to just have these slower moments within this last chunk. So most of the time when I've been going through these episodes, I kind of go through because I take notes as I watch. I go through in mostly chronological order my thoughts as I was watching through these. I'm not going to do that for this just because it was rather action-oriented. It was very much rooted in exploring this dungeon, and then we'd have the next part of the trials, and I just don't know that I have too many thoughts on a lot of these things because so much of what I have enjoyed talking about with Frieren are the themes and all of the little people you meet along the way and their quiet stories. And this last part wasn't as much that. And when I started by saying I feel like Frieren is very much a love letter to the fantasy fan, I noted that that includes all of its positives and also maybe a few of its negatives, so I am going to touch on that. I don't think by any means that what are negatives for me are going to be negatives for everyone. I don't think these are objective flaws about the story, But I think that, as I talked about in what I found to be great about this story, is how it managed to be unique through something familiar. However, in this last part, I felt like we lost some of what made it unique, and it was often just familiar, and that was the majority of it. We also didn't spend as much time with our main cast of characters. I'm very open to getting introduced to more characters. Time and time again throughout this first season, you get introduced to somebody, sometimes not even for an entire episode. Sometimes it's just for about half of an episode. And you either fall in love with these characters, you're very endeared to them, you're very moved by their stories. And I talked about in the previous batch, Old Man Vole. Oh, he stole my heart. I loved him so much. And then even some of our characters that are not necessarily with us in present day, but we get through memories, like Heiter, for example. Anytime there's any exchange between Heiter and Fern, that also pulls at my heart. I love those moments. And within this second chunk, we have we get introduced to characters and we just have these brief little glimpses. And I like sometimes the ways that those brief glimpses will pull you in and make you intrigued. There is the character that makes clones of himself, and you really hardly see him speak. And there's one line in particular that stood out to me quite a lot, which is when he defeats another individual during the first trial, and he says, he says something to the effect of, "I trust very few people," or "I don't trust anyone." And that alone made me want to know more about him. Why doesn't he trust people? What is the reason? Who is the reason? What's behind that? Is it something that's lasted his entire life? Did he have a moment where somebody betrayed him? And I just wanted to know more about him. There were other times, though, where I think because we had so many characters introduced so quickly in the last chunk, that we had to rely on almost caricatures or an ongoing joke that got old kind of quickly. So, for example, we have the two characters that are consistently fighting with each other. The one pulls on the other's pigtails, and I was somewhat disappointed in the progression of those characters. I did find I started to like them more as it progressed because you got a little bit more of them, but the story really set itself up to have high expectations for how it did character work because it did it so well so quickly early on. And I think with these characters, it started to rely on these goofy moments to just almost be like comedic effect, which is not to say that's all the value these characters had by any means, but they just played that up so often. You'd have all of them try to strategize within the second trial. How are we going to get to the bottom? How are we going to defeat these replicas? What are we going to do? And then you see them in the background wrestling again. And you're like, okay, I get it. I think the moments, though, that were, as far as the characters are concerned, the parts that maybe let me down just a little bit in comparison to how characters were done early on and how even world building details and backstories were done early on, is there were two specific instances within the first portion, the first trial, that I thought were not handled the best. One example is early on, there is this confrontation between Verbal, who is known to be this very strong warrior, and specifically a warrior mage. And they go up against the character Ubel, who we've been getting glimpses of and very much seems to be one of those characters that they just are so unlike anybody else. They're not like other mages, we'll say. And these characters are having this confrontation. It's very clear that they're both very powerful, and he does have her in this binding spell. And she is trying to gauge whether or not he seriously is going to actually kill her or not. And so she's talking to him, and he likely correctly identifies to some degree. He says, "Are you just trying to buy time?" I kind of liked the awareness that this character had because, again, something I think Frieren does so well throughout the entirety of the story for the most part, is it takes the things that we actually do get slightly irritated within fantasy, and then it either faces those things head on or it acknowledges those things and then it has a nod to them, but then it does something fun with them. And I think a good example is Frieren getting stuck within the mimics. I think that's always a lot of fun. But in this instance, I was excited to see a character correctly state, like, you're just trying to buy time, and then also not be pulled in and be sucked into it. But instead they said, "Are you trying to buy time? Well, okay." And then they say, "I'll just play along." And then they just talk through some of how they're thinking, has been influenced when it comes to whether or not they're going to harm another person. And I thought that was a little bit of a clunky way to give us some of this character's backstory. I think that there were other instances throughout the trials where that was not the situation. And there were times where, like, for example, the character Denkin, I thought the way that that character was executed throughout the entirety of the trials was much more polished. It was much more organic. There were times where it was very moving. There were times where you heard a little bit. He talked about wanting to visit a grave, and you're thinking, okay, now I have more hints about him. He is playing a bigger role within this new cast of characters, so you're going to get more of his backstory than maybe some of the rest of theirs, which is fine. I didn't need everybody's backstories by any means, but his was one that was like slowly revealed to you. And what I talked about with the one character where you're pulled in just from that one line of them talking about not trusting people, I was very much pulled into Denkin's story. And then as we learn more about him, as we see how he interacts with other characters and his relationship to magic, his way of associating wealth and status to the mistakes of his past, that's how he saw it, which was devastating because he felt like that was the reason he couldn't save his wife's life. So his character was one that you slowly got to know. And then as you did discover more about him, it made you look back, and with the hindsight you then had, all of his ways of being made sense. To have that be done, in my opinion, so exceptionally, it ended up making moments like the one I just described with Ubel and Verpal, it made them stand out as not as strong. I think another example that felt a little bit clunky had to do with the other individual that was associated with Denkin that was part of the trio within the first trial. That character then going up against the characters that Frieren was allied with for this trial. And there is a specific moment when they're facing off so that Frieren and Denkin can face off with just the two of them with no distractions. And the character at one point, while fighting, tells the other two, "Let me lecture you." And then they just start talking about magic. You could almost argue, because one of the characters says, "Oh, you love magic so much, you even went so far as to lecture us," which then makes me think that there's a very specific reason why you wanted us away from a body of water. So there was, I think, a little bit more intentionality behind that line and the way in which they were explaining some of the magic. But there were so many instances throughout this story where there were very organic ways of revealing the magic to us. So for example, you'd get moments of Frieren and Fern practicing, which in this particular story, because so much of what's beautiful about this are the little moments, the slower moments in life, and thus the more, okay, we're going to wake up and we're going to train today, or we're going to wake up and we're going to, or in Frieren's case, we're going to sleep in, and then later we're going to work on something to do with this sort of spell. I think that there were plenty of opportunities for the world building to be revealed to us in ways that felt very inviting. And I think some of the ways that we got magic world building details and character, some of their, not necessarily backstories, but just more information about them, was not the strongest within this batch. Something I think that I would have enjoyed a little bit more is to let some of these characters remain more mysterious to us, and also not rely necessarily on these ongoing jokes or making these characters feel a little too larger than life so that we feel at least like we have an idea of them. Their designs were very unique, so that alone already made them fairly distinct. I feel like their relationship with magic made them fairly distinct. So I didn't mind getting some things about them revealed to us, but I think I would have preferred some of it left a mystery. Some of the world building things I think could have been executed more seamlessly. And then we could have really focused in on the action, because it was a very action-oriented last chunk of the show. And the action in this is beautifully animated. The music always accompanies it in such a vibrant way. And I especially really liked the replicas versus the mages themselves within the dungeon portion of the trial. I think the idea is, once again, it's not a unique idea, a character facing off against themselves. That is sort of a thing that we see. It's almost like a trope that we see in action scenes within fantasy. So it was fun to see it here, and when I got really excited about it was when it turned out that until they defeat the actual enemy that is causing these, they're just going to keep coming back. But that was revealed to you pretty much at the end of the action. And I think if we had cut some of the other moments and then we took more time to have the action with the various different mages the ways that they use different spells and what their strengths and weaknesses are, and you see them face off against their replica, and then okay, it seems like a bunch of them have handled the replicas. Okay, but now they're all coming back. What are we going to do? I think that would have made it a little bit more engaging and a little bit more exciting. It wasn't that it had no excitement whatsoever. It was exciting, but I think I just wanted a little bit more because a lot of the dungeon element felt just so familiar to me, and I don't feel like we did anything exceptionally unique with it. So I also think because there is so much action in this section and there's so much that is pushing the plot itself forward, that we didn't have as much time for the quieter moments. They were here and there. We're also getting more introduced to how Frieren's backstory relates to, we see this new elf introduced, so we're getting a little bit more of that. But those quieter moments that I love so much about this show, we don't see them as frequently. And that's what I think really makes this familiar setting actually have a unique flair to it. But because those were somewhat pushed aside, I don't feel like that familiarity had anything balancing it out. But I think especially something that affected the balance in this last part was the lack of Stark. I mean, I've said before that this is probably my favorite character, and having him hardly be in this whole last section, it was rough. I love this character. I like his interactions with our other party members, and I did like that little tiny interaction between Stark and Verbal when they're like, you look strong, you come join us, okay? And I also really liked that at one point they were leaving and all the little kids were like, oh, Stark, are you gonna play with us? And he's like, oh, sorry, not today. I just love the idea that Stark is always making friends everywhere he goes, and he genuinely seems like he wants to do kind things for people. I like that you get these little moments here and there without it necessarily feeling the need to constantly show you scene after scene of it. So I think it's done so well, but there was just such a lack of this character that I loved so much. It probably is coming across like I'm maybe being exceptionally negative about this last portion of the story, and I don't mean for it to come across that way because I really have enjoyed Frieren, and I just think that how it incorporates memories into the story, how it really facilitates the ideas of cherishing the little moments, but then also not taking things for granted, learning to embrace life, but also don't get stuck in one single place. Make sure that you actually continuously value the people in your life, that you take advantage of every opportunity around you, that you take care of yourself and others, and realize sometimes the joy in something is not necessarily rooted in what you get out of it, but what someone else does. And if they find joy in it, then that then means that there's happiness for you as well. I just feel like so many of those elements were so lovely and so beautiful, and I think I just missed them a little bit in the second half. To sort of summarize all of this, I do think that where the story ended, while it is of course the end of the first season, and I think it ended in a satisfying place, especially after such a long arc, I think in a way I'm ready for the next thing. So it sort of just felt like, okay, I got through that arc. Now I need those few episodes that are a little bit softer and quieter, and then we'll move on to the next big thing, except for it's just the end of the season. So I'm like, I was looking forward to what new spell Frieren's gonna find or things like that. And now I'm just waiting. And I'm sure a lot of you feel that too, the sadness of now I'm just waiting for what comes next. But I do look forward to seeing what comes next. There are a lot of little details, especially with the very far past that you saw with Frieren and her mentor. I am very curious to see how that's going to come back into the picture and how it's going to tie together with a lot of the threats that we see from the demons. So I kind of wonder if this story is going to turn out to be a little bit bigger and actually have more actual threats and more specific antagonists moving forward than we had necessarily in this first season, and if a lot of what was transpiring throughout was actually laying the groundwork for the stakes to get bigger and bigger as we go. Maybe it won't. If it's a return to the quieter moments and we never even get an arc as long as the certification arc, that's fine with me too. I'm just curious and excited to see where it goes from here. As we segue now though into the conclusion of this discussion, there were elements to the very last episode that I think perfectly capture the last place that we're left at within the story. So first off, there is a quote that I really loved from Verbal of all characters, and it said, "Always treasure the people you meet. Death is far from this lifetime's only goodbye." And how that's woven in with what you see Himmel say about why he doesn't like long goodbyes, and his reason for not liking them is because he always kind of looks at life as there's always going to be another opportunity. It'd be so embarrassing if I made such a big fuss about a goodbye when I'm sure I'm going to see you again. I think that's such a perfect way to capture the end of the season. So even though there was a few things that I was just touching on that made me feel like, oh, I'm ready for that next quiet moment before the next big thing, I do feel like that was a really beautiful way to end this season. In general, though, I'd be very curious to see your overall thoughts, and I really would love to know what for you was your very favorite thing about Frieren. It can be hyper specific or it can be more of a summary. And then what was something that, even if you really love it, that you think was maybe a slight con for you? I would love to see both kind of the pros and cons for you, as of course any story, even my all-time favorites, there are things about them that I don't think are necessarily absolutely perfect, because no one story is catered just to my tastes. Every story has things that are going to appeal to us. That's what makes Frieren, I think, so beautiful and so artistic, is that there's so much about it that captures so much of what it is to be alive and to cherish what we have in life. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.